It's my privilege to introduce our main speaker today, Hedrick Smith. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning former New York Times reporter, a correspondent and producer of an Emmy Award-winning producer. He has established himself over 50 years of distinguished journalism as one of America's most distinguished. He earned this position with on-the-ground reporting. He covered Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights struggles. He was posted in Saigon to cover the Vietnam War. From his Cairo post, he covered the Mideast. And from both Moscow and Washington, D.C., he covered the Cold War as well as 6 American presidents and their administration. And when he wrapped all that up, he then started on the second part of his career, which is to be an extremely accomplished novelist, or book writer, an author, and also television producer of primetime specials. Some of those subjects have been on hotly debated topics like terrorism, Wall Street, Soviet perestroika, healthcare reform, education reform, Washington's power game, Walmart, and Enron. No light subjects in there at all. With the empathy and determination of a master journalist, Hendrick Smith has written his latest book, Who Stole the American Dream, which he considers his best effort so far, and he says the book that changed both his thinking and his writing. Please welcome Hendrick Smith to our podium.
Thank you very much, President Laura. I'd like to thank also Mark Wright, with whom I had a few moments on King TV this morning, for inviting me here and arranging this, and to Diane Tilstra, your Rotary member from Tacoma, who has not only hosted me and gotten me involved in a number of speeches and lectures, but is now engineering here locally some of the reform efforts that I may get a chance to talk to you about either in the substance or in question and answer. And I had to think for a moment as I was listening to Fiona, who had the genius to dream up putting the two of us together on a program? And what was the thought that linked us? And the answer is strategy. Chess is a game of strategy. And the question about America today and about the American dream is whether or not we're pursuing a strategy that works for the country and particularly works for the middle of the country. If you ask Americans and read the polls, you find out that they're not only giving the president and the Congress and both political parties low ratings, but that confidence in our political system is at a low level for 40 years. And one of the most recent polls I read said that 63% of the American people think the country is in decline. Now, you probably can't tell that from this gorgeous luncheon in this great hotel in this great city today. But the country is deeply uneasy, and I suspect, despite the pleasure of today's program and the comfort of today's meal, there's a lot of uneasiness in this room. When I think of the idea of America in decline, it takes me back to the time when I went to Oxford after Williams College and read that great British historian Arnold Toynbee. He wrote a 12-volume history of the world of 21 civilizations over 6,000 years. I don't want to tell you I read all 12 volumes. But I did read a 2-volume abridgment, which was 1,200 pages long, and it was not easy sledding. But what Toynbee has to say is very relevant to us today. He tells the story of human civilization in terms of challenge and response. Every civilization is challenged, and whether or not it survives, thrives, grows, and continues depends on its response to the challenge. He starts way back. He starts with the ancient Egyptians on the Nile and the Incans in the mountains of Latin America. Their challenge, he said, interesting, I never thought of it this way, but their challenge was a hostile environment. Could they form an agricultural economy that would support a civilization? Well, we know they did it. We can still see the temples of Machu Picchu or along the Nile. But they fell victim to another challenge, which is the challenge of an effective, more powerful outside military invader. In the case of Egypt, the Ottoman Turks. In the case of the Incans, the Spaniards. Now, that's a challenge we know something about in America. We know how to deal with that. A tougher challenge militarily. We dealt with Hitler and the Axis powers in Pearl Harbor in World War II. And we dealt with a Cold War threat from the Soviet Union over half a century. But then Toynbee goes on and he starts talking about the civilizations that we admire the most, ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And what he tells us is that they fell victim to what Toynbee calls schisms in the soul of the society, schisms in the body politic. Now think about it. He says ancient Greece and ancient Rome collapsed in the end because of challenges from within that they couldn't cope with. Well, think about America today. I believe that's our challenge. That's our chess game that we're going to have to figure out how to play well together and become grandmasters along with Fiona, because we've slipped. Pick up the New York Times this morning, and it tells you that low-income people in America are making less money than people in a half a dozen countries in Europe and Canada. And in the middle class, Canada is now caught up to us, and we're under threat of being overtaken by others. We used to be the land of opportunity, and now it is easier to rise from the bottom to the middle to the top in Germany, France, Sweden, Britain, Scandinavia, Australia, and Canada. We've slipped. We know we've slipped. So the question is, why did that happen? Were we there? How do we do it? We used to have a bipartisan politics that worked. Yeah, Nixon and Johnson fought like crazy, and Republicans and Democrats in that era. But that was an era in which we passed Medicare and Medicaid. We sent people to the moon when we had the challenge of Sputnik. We passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Believe it or not, we passed budgets every year. And every year we passed 13 appropriation bills for every budget. This time, this era, if we pass a single continuing resolution, it is a hallelujah moment in Washington. So we've got a broken political system, and we've got an economic system that has left the middle class behind. Am I imagining that, or was it different before? And I'm white-haired now, and when I think back to the time when I was coming out of college and living those first 15 or 20 years after college, I sort of remember prosperity was more widely shared in America. But you know, people who are white-haired have a tendency to remember that everything was above average when we were young. We had the Lake Wobegon, right? Yeah, everything was better. Everything was above average when I was a young man, boy. We'd say things like that. So I went back and checked. What's interesting and important to know is that from 1945 to the mid-70s, the productivity of the American workforce roughly doubled. It went up 97%. And the median household income, the income of the people absolutely in the middle of the American economy, went up 95%. 97 and 95. Fast forward, in the last 30 years, productivity has risen 80%. Not as good, but a very good record. Median household income has gone up 10%. And the main reason it's gone up 10%, more women are working more hours. If you take the pay of an average male worker, pay and compensation, benefits, as well as pay, in 2011, the typical middle-income American worker made the same amount of money in 2011 as in 1978, adjusted for inflation. Now you say adjusted for inflation, that means they kept up with the cost of clothing, food, transportation, gasoline, and so forth. But the four big items that bust a family budget, health care, retirement, college education, and housing, went through the roof. So that if a middle-class American family, parents today, tried to deliver what their parents did in 1978, they had to go into debt. They could not afford it. And that is what you hear from Americans in the middle class today. They are under stress. They're anxious. We're not delivering for them. Now, question, I don't have a lot of time here to explain why we had it before and what's happened since. There are two main reasons why we had it before. And there's one sort of ancillary reason. One is we came out of World War II and we were king of the hill and nobody else had a working economy. Not only were our enemies, the Germans and the Japanese, destroyed, but so were our allies, the French, the British, the rest of them. But within about 15 years, by the early 60s, the Germans had had their miracle, the Japanese had recovered. And from then on, you have to take a look and say, how did this prosperity get shared widely? It got shared widely for two reasons. And they're both important to us today. One is that we had business leaders who believed it was their job, their social responsibility. They even used the term their sacred duty to balance the economic interests of all the stakeholders in the corporation. And by stakeholders, what they meant was that all the groups that had a stake in the success of the company. Now, obviously, that includes the owners, but it also includes the managers, includes the employees, and includes the suppliers and the creditors and the customers and the communities they operate in. The state of Washington has a stake in the success of Boeing and Costco and all kinds of other fine companies here, Microsoft and so forth. We know that, but we forget it. They used to live by that. And they thought it was smart business. I'm talking Charlie Wilson, the CEO of General Motors, Reg Jones, the CEO of General Electric, Frank Abrams, the CEO of Standard Oil of New Jersey, now ExxonMobil. They believed, and they used the term sacred trust to balance these interests. They thought it was smart business and smart economics. Henry Ford said it at one point, if I pay my workers $5 a day, they can afford to buy the Ford motor cars, the Model Ts that we make at Ford Motor. And those other guys in the 50s and 60s and 70s said the same thing. They can buy the refrigerators and so forth that we produce if we pay them well enough. And economists call that economy at that time the virtuous circle of growth. If you pay tens of millions of middle-class Americans well, they'll go out and spend their money. Americans, basically, middle-class Americans, have enough money to save by making the mortgage payment and the down payment on the mortgage. They don't save a lot more. They spend 95% of what they get in good times and 105% of what they get in bad times. So they're spending their money, and that's what's driving the economy. I just was reading numbers in the Wall Street Journal this morning. 68% of what drives the American economy is consumer spending. 18%, by the way, is government spending. Investment is only down about 14 or 15%. The real engine is what, the real job creators in America are right in this room, both as innovators, both as small business people, and as consumers. That's what made it move. And the second thing that ensured a reasonably wide dispersal of wealth in that country at that time was citizen power, people power. Think of it, the civil rights movement expanded voting access for blacks. The women's movement. 50 years ago, Betty Friedan wrote A Feminine Mystique. People said it was wrong for women to be making 41 cents on the dollar for doing the same work as men. They put the pressure on. Women went out there and protested. I don't know about you, but I remember women went braless. Most of us men didn't know what to do with it. We were both enticed and baffled by it. But they made the point. They were in our faces. They said, this has got to change. We just had Earth Day 2 days ago, wasn't it? Yesterday. Yesterday. Do you know how many people protested in April 1970, April 22nd, about the fouling of America's airways and America's waters? 20 million people went into the streets, to shopping malls, to university campuses, got on the radio, got on television, had talkathons. Within 1 year, Congress passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation. People power had an impact on government policy. You know, there was a consumers movement. Ralph Nader talking about American automakers making cars with defects, causing accidents, killing people. Sound familiar? So the point was there were these movements that began to affect the way government operated. And they also affected the way money was distributed. I don't know if you remember, but back in that time, the maximum marginal tax rate under Dwight Eisenhower, Republican president in the 1950s, was 92%. It got cut by the Democrats, by Jack Kennedy, all the way down to 77%. Now the attitude today is people wouldn't work if the government took that big a chunk of their money. Well, I remember people working very hard, and if you go back and read the stories about Charlie Wilson and the rest of them, they worked very hard. But what's important to know is that was redistributing income, and it was helping support safety net programs and spreading the wealth around the country. And the average annual growth rate in the 1950s and 60s was 3%, just between 3 and 3.1%. Now fast forward to the 2000s, the maximum marginal tax rate was 35% under George W. Bush, Republican, and Barack Obama, Democrat. And the average annual growth rate, including the period before the collapse of 2008, was less than 1%. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no connection, according to our historical record, between the marginal tax rate and the growth rate of the economy. So we ought to set that one aside. But the point was, there was people power affecting the way government operated, and there was a conception within the private sector that the way to make the economy work and the way to make your company profitable was to pay people a decent wage with good benefits. I don't have time to go into the details. There are lots of them in my book. But fast forward, what the heck happened? What happened? Part of what happened was the idea within the business community, and particularly in business schools, changed. It changed from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism. What the job of the CEO, Milton Friedman, the famous Chicago economist, University of Chicago economist, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote in 1961, was it is the mission of the CEO to maximize return to shareholders, and any other thing that the CEO tries to do is immoral. Not just economically wrong, but immoral. Took a while. But by the early 1980s, what Milton Friedman wrote and what some of his students managed to turn into the concept of pay for performance and awarding large stock grants and stock options to CEOs and other senior executives and board members became the practice in America. It's not universal. We still have companies like Costco where the CEO takes a modest salary compared to what happens at Walmart. But by and large, American leadership in business moved to the idea that business ought to take a bigger share. People at the top ought to take a bigger share. Now listen to one number here. From 1979 to 2011, 84% of the growth in the entire nation's income went to the top 1%. I just told you a moment ago that at the absolute middle, for men, zero gain. For CEOs and S&P 500 companies, a gain of 350, 400%. At the top 1%, a gain of 600% in income. The gap has been enormous. This isn't just liberal economists telling you this. Citigroup put out a report in 2005 and said that the United States has the greatest inequality of income in a major economy. We're not talking underdeveloped economies here. In a major economy since 16th century Spain. That's 500 years. So the middle class is stagnating, and the people at the top are doing enormously well. And guess what? Every time we try to come out of a recession, not just this recession, but every recession we have come out of since 1990, it has taken us longer to come out of the recession. It took us 18 to 20 months prior to 1990. In the early 1990s, it took us 26 months. In the early 2000s, it took us 46 months. We are now 60 months, and Janet Yellen tells us it's going to take us another 24 months to get there. That's 84 months. Something is structurally wrong. Structurally wrong. Okay, so we need to address that. We need to come up with a chess strategy as a nation that's going to make growth work and share prosperity again. And the other thing that happened was in the public sector was that there was a backlash against the very forces I mentioned to you before, the consumers movement, the environmental movement, the women's movement, the labor movement. The bosses revolted back in the late 1970s. I'm embarrassed to admit that I was running the Washington Bureau of the New York Times while this was happening, and I saw some of the symptoms, but not until I went to work on this book did I come to understand what the causes were. A guy named Lewis Powell wrote a famous memo back in 1971 that none of us had ever heard of. Lewis Powell was the guy Richard Nixon put on the Supreme Court in 1972. Famous corporate lawyer, great influence, a lot of close connections with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He went to his buddies and said, we're getting killed in the political arena by all these movements. We need to organize business. He wrote a memo. It's in my book. I said to Random House, this is the most important neglected document in American history in the last 50 years. We should include the text of it in the book. It's there if you want to read it. He said, business, you've got to organize. You've got to pool your money. You've got to identify your enemies, political enemies. You've got to go after them aggressively. And that's what happened. They took the high ground. Powell's army started, and we didn't even know it had been organized. And you start to see the influence. It's amazing. You see the policy shift in the most pivotal session of Congress in the last 50 years in 1978, when Jimmy Carter was in the White House and when the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. If I had more time, I'd go into detail. But 401k gets put into the law. Corporate bankruptcy laws get changed. Interest laws get changed. Corporate tax comes down instead of going up. The capital gains tax, the investment tax comes down. Deregulation starts. All that starts under Carter before Reagan gets going. And the Reagan tax cuts have added $1 trillion to the wealth of the top 1% every decade since then. $1 trillion in the 1980s, $1 trillion in the 1990s, $1 trillion in the 2000s, and the Bush tax cuts of 2001 added another $1 trillion. So on top of the changing, carving up of the pie in the private sector, public sector policy has greatly favored the people at the top. And at the same time their tax rates came down from 92 to 77 to 35, the payroll tax that every worker has to pay and that Mitt Romney forgot about when he made the comment about the 43% in the campaign, that has more than doubled. The estate tax has come down, the exclusion has gone way up, and the minimum wage is stuck back at a level 25% below where it was, adjusted for inflation in 1968. So and I could go through a whole ream of policies. I don't have time for that. We're in a predicament now where we have an economy that doesn't work, and we have the money that has been accumulated by the wealthy that is now coming into our politics and flooding our politics. We're already in this campaign seeing twice as much money spent in the congressional campaign of 2014 as in 2010. We now have much more money flowing to independent groups coming from wealthy billionaires on both sides. I'm nonpartisan on this. The whole system's screwed up. I'm not arguing for one party or the other. We have money coming in that we can't track anymore. We don't know who the givers are because people can give to 501c4s without revealing who the sources are, and the 501c4s now then give the money to the candidates. We can't track it back. If we don't know where the money is coming from behind a candidate, we don't really know who the candidate stands for. And that's one of the jobs we have in the press to try to tell you this. We have a gerrymandered political system in this country where today a smart political reporter in Washington can predict the outcome of the November elections for the House of Representatives in 90% of the districts in the country. We're a country that believes in competition. It's in our DNA. We believe it in industry, we believe it in the media, we believe it in education, we believe it in the economy. How can we possibly have a situation where we've eliminated competition in 90% of the districts that are going to represent us in the next Congress? I can tell you, as a longtime observer of Washington, I'm going to take a great interest in who wins the election in 2014 and who wins the election in 2016. But I can also tell you, as a guy who studied the last 50 years of American history, that no matter who gets elected, not much is going to change in Washington. There's going to be only marginal changes until we fix the systemic problems we have. We need a better chess strategy. We need better grand champions, and the grand champions have got to be right here in this room. Because as long as the people in this room say the people in Washington have got to fix it, as long as the pronoun in the sentence we use about fixing the American economy or fixing the American political system is they, as long as it's the third person, it isn't going to happen. Only when we change the pronoun in the sentence and make it we, today, we, have got to do something about it. That's why I mentioned Diane Tilstra. I made a speech like this about 4 or 5 months ago down at UW-Tacoma, and they have organized study groups around some of the ideas that I'm kicking around in my book. And it's not my book. It's the notion that we've got to get back in the game here. We've got to take our country back. We have to rebuild. We have to reclaim the American dream. And it's got to start here today. Thank you.
Loved your words.
Thank you.
The one thing I've noticed is a very different approach toward community and employees in larger small businesses. And I've sensed their focus of the CEO and the board is more on the company than on shareholders per se. Not sure that's accurate. But there clearly was a difference in the involvement at where there's private companies versus public. I wonder if you sense
Well,
anything there.
you know, obviously, family-owned businesses where the ownership is very close to the employees, where it's very close to the community that people are operating in. I mean, I think of the great bank that you had here in this state, Washington Mutual. It was the family-friendly bank forever. That was its motto. And its whole objective was to help people buy homes over a period of time and have that connection. What happened was in the crazy go-go housing boom, the whole ethic of the business changed in that sense of connection with the community. And I'm not just talking about employees, I'm talking about clients, was we can actually make more money if we charge higher fees to initiate a mortgage and we sell the mortgage to Wall Street. And never mind whether or not it's going to fail, because we've made our profit up front. And I'm not picking on Washington Mutual, I'm simply saying, to me at least, that's indicative of what you're talking about. The ethic changed, the way we made profit changed, and our sense of connection changed. I mean, I have to tell you, when we stood up to sing this song at the beginning here, the bouncing ball and so forth, I sort of laughed. And then I thought, you know, I like that. That's a nice thing about Rotary. We get up and we sing off key with our neighbors, we don't pay any attention to it. But there's something important about that. There's something important about fellowship and community. And we've gotten so focused on large and larger organizations, and the internet has become an enormously powerful instrument for communication, but it actually distances practically everybody, unless you're one of those folks like the younger generation who spends all your time, you know, shooting selfies and then putting them on Facebook and shipping them around. So I think you're right. I mean, I think we've lost some of the fabric. And part of it is the untrammeled pursuit of profit and shareholder return without, and it's not fair to say that's what all companies are doing. You know, Jim Sinegal runs Costco in a very different way. You know, he's a great model of the old stakeholder model to me. I mean, he takes $2 million, the CEO of Walmart gets $23 million, he pays higher pay per hour, he pays better health benefits. So I don't want to tar everybody here. There's a real difference. But that sense of connection with the human beings is really important, and we're losing that, and in the process, I think we're losing something much more fundamental. I mean, I think we're at a point, I'm serious about this. John Gardner said this not too long ago. He said, we are walking the edge of a precipice. We're walking the edge of a precipice. Civilizations die of disenchantment. If enough people lose faith in their society, the whole thing begins to fall apart. I didn't begin with Toynbee by accident. I think the stakes today are enormously high. And if we're simply pursuing our own personal benefit without connecting with the needs of the larger society, and I don't mean just the poor, I mean connections and as a whole, I think we're headed downhill. I think we're about to live Rome all over again, and there are 63% of the people who already believe we are. I don't want to have that be the outcome. I'd like to turn it around. But that means stirring people up to think in a different way, get out of the box, and get back to the kind of thing you were talking about. Thank you, sir. Anybody else?
A question over here, please.
Mr. Smith, thank you for being with us here today and sharing your ideas. You traced a lot of this back to the Carter administration and that era, setting the stage for this. And I was curious as to your thoughts of the effect of the fall of the Soviet Union, and to what degree these problems are internal, and or to what degree they were kept in check by having that great adversary and its recent repositioning.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What a great question. What that suggests is that we rally together and have a sense of solidarity as Americans when we have an external threat. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think that post-war generation where Charlie Wilson said what's good for General Motors is good for America, and what's good for America is good for Charlie Wilson, obviously, but also for General Motors. Forgive my Freudian slip. I think that partly did grow out of World War II. It wasn't just that we won. It wasn't just that we were king of the hill. It was that we understood that we had won together, that we're in it together. And we've really gotten away from that. So the loss of that is one thing. But the other thing that happened, I think, that was terribly damaging is we assumed we'd had a victory of capitalism over communism, and that ended the argument. Now, European countries like Germany practice the old stakeholder capitalism. There's a different kind of capitalism at work in Europe. And by the way, Germany has had a $2 million trade surplus in the last decade while we had a $6 trillion trade deficit. Germany's kept 21% of its workforce in manufacturing. We're down to 9%. They've increased the wages of the average worker in Germany 5 times faster than in America. And we're told American companies can't do that and still be competitive. So I think what we did is we started to rest on our oars, and we sort of let the market run just as it would, without saying, you know, there are ground rules in the market. We have traffic rules. Everybody doesn't just drive down the highway any way they want. You go in a certain lane, you obey traffic lights, and so on and so forth. Well, the same thing is true, are the ground rules for a free and fair and competitive marketplace. I'm not against that. I mean, part of what Ralph Nader and company were about was making things more transparent. We're engaged in that right now with General Motors. They sat on top of the information, you know, for how many years? 7, 8, 9, 10 years that they had defective cars. We're not saying capitalism can't go and can't compete, but it's got to be straight. It's got to be honest. We got a crazy tax system. Most of you probably run businesses that operate entirely in the state of Washington, certainly entirely in the United States. You are subject to a corporate tax rate of 35%. In my opinion, we should lower that rate and make it easier for you all to expand business. But to do that, we should close the loopholes that let multinationals pay a much lower tax rate. They pay nothing on the profits they make overseas until they want to bring the money back, and then they mass together and lobby Congress, and the last time they did that was 2005, and they got a 5.5% tax rate. That, to me, is not a level playing field within capitalism. So we got a bunch of things like that where we sort of said, well, we beat the Soviet Union, everything's all settled, we can go our easy way. I'm back to it. I'm back to the example we just got from Uganda. We've got to have a smarter chess strategy for the country as a whole. And there are all kinds of components to it. Somebody else was down here.
Over here?
Yeah.
What's your thought on term limits?
I think term limits is a chimera. The problem is, at least as I've been watching Washington for a long time, and I've done several documentaries on it, and I wrote a book called The Power Game some time ago, How Washington Works, which made its way onto the president's bedside table and into lots of congressional offices. What happens is you give more power to lobbyists and to staff. Most members of Congress, when they show up in Congress, are not worth much for about 3 or 4 years. They don't know enough about how it operates. So they're totally dependent early in their careers on their staffs and on lobbyists. And by the way, lobbyists have their greatest influence not when they're pushing for the passage or the defeat of a bill. They have the greatest influence when they write the bill. And I'll give you just one example. The paragraph in the law that set up the 401k plan was written by the lobby attorneys for Eastman Kodak. And it was handed verbatim to Barbara Conable, a senior Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee, because Kodak and Xerox had their home offices in his district in Rochester, and nobody else on the Ways and Means Committee paid any attention to it at all, because at that time it was only a tax shelter for profit-sharing bonuses for executives at those 2 companies and a bunch of New York banks. That's how it operates. That's how Washington actually operates. So the temptation is to say we can fix it by running those jerks out of office after 4 years or 6 years or 10 years or whatever. The difficulty is it's only as they spend some time there that they actually can begin to get some independence. But with the money system we have, the dependence changes from staff to campaign funders to lobbyists. I think we could have a law that says no lobbyist can contribute to a campaign of a member of a committee before which his business has business. I mean, we've got to stop somehow. But in order to do that, we're probably going to have to pass a constitutional amendment that says Congress has the power to regulate campaign contributions, because with the way Supreme Court decisions are going, all the campaign restrictions on money are going out the window. I don't know where we are on time.
Another question over here, please.
Yes. By the way, there is in the state of Washington now a petition being circulated. What is it, 1329? 1329, which is calling for a ballot initiative to be voted on this fall calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and the McCutcheon decision. Yes.
Maybe you just touched on my question. It was, you've spoken about the financial sector and public response, but what about the legal sector, whether it's the Supreme Court or the lack of culpability for some senior officers in finance houses and so on?
I just wrote a review of a book by a guy named Matt Taibbi. It's called The Divide. And the book is absolutely devoted to the failure of the Justice Department to prosecute anybody in any major financial institution. We have, for example, he cites the case of HSBC Bank, the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which admitted to fraudulently laundering money for drug cartels in South America, for terrorist groups in the Middle East, for countries against which the United States has imposed financial sanction, and for the Russian mafia. That's a pretty good list, right? They admitted fraud, and yet not a, and you know what the Justice Department did? They came in and they got a nice big penalty. I forget what it was. It's about $2 billion, so it was nice. Somebody got some money back, which is good. But there was nobody prosecuted at all for that. And at the same time, if you have somebody down here in Seattle who gets caught with a bunch of reefers in their pocket, they go to jail. Now, there's something wacko about that. That's the guy's point here. Yeah, I think we have a serious problem here. And the reason is the fines that the major banks are paying, and we're now up into, what, $50 billion of fines. You can hardly pick the paper up any given week that there isn't some bank that's admitted they did something wrong and they've just paid a fairly large, 7, 8-figure, 9-figure fine. So it's fairly pervasive. So it's there, but you still don't have any deterrent. It's only when a few people start to say, Jesus, if we do that, we're going to jail. Hey, Henry, I don't think we ought to do that. I mean, we talk about deterrence, capital punishment for murder. We talk about deterrence for drug dealing. We need to talk about deterrence for fraud. The fraud in our financial industry. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I spent 50 years reporting. I've done documentaries for PBS. When I started doing this book, I could not believe how pervasive the fraud was. The fraud inside of Washington Mutual, which they themselves discovered and reported on internally. They had an office down in Los Angeles that was doing some of the biggest business for Washington Mutual. They found 83% of the loans were fraudulent, and the fraud was initiated inside the offices of the bank, not by the borrowers. They had another office where the fraudulent rate was 57%. This is the bank itself. It never disciplined anybody. The heads of those offices were flown to Hawaii and celebrated and given the President's Award along with a bunch of other because they were high-volume producers. Now, something's wrong. I think when we're talking about the fate of a civilization, you look at public mistrust in institutions, and it certainly includes us in the press, and we deserve it along with everybody else. We have not done a good job in the media of informing people. We've collected the dots and thrown the dots at you. We have not connected the dots. We haven't helped make history make sense. We've not connected today's events to the consequences tomorrow and so forth. And we haven't gone back and explained enough. As I said, I learned a hell of a lot myself by just stopping for 2.5 years and doing nothing but trying to understand how the hell we got into this mess. Thank you very much.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.